Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you here. Though, did you hear a bit of the steel band drum up there? Ah, well, I like it when they play Mozart. But of course, those drums are originally cut out of oil drums because during World War II, there were all of them left over. And so some smart fellow said, "Well, we can do this," and so now it's sort of a characteristic of the islands. And I'm going to talk today just about the heritage of the Caribbean islands. I'm sure many of you have been to many of these places already, but have you been to here? Here's my flag of the day. Anybody who can name that flag gets a free trip to Haiti. Oh well, we don't get to stop there yet. Next time I'll have a Cuban flag, and this ship, like many of these, will probably be going to Cuba soon. Well, that'll be the day. But I'm going to just sort of give you a bit of an overview of the human conditions of the Caribbean, and then maybe I'll have time to talk about oceanography and the natural history on another day. But of course, this is a remarkable part of the world in that it's been called the Mediterranean of the Americas, except that it's all open. All these, also it's called the nation of islands. But there are over 7,000 inhabited islands and all sorts of rocks and things everywhere from where we came up from Trinidad to Guyana up to Barbados, which is the most southeastern of all the islands, and then up to the French and English and Spanish-speaking islands, and the Antilles, which are the large islands, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and then Cuba. So this is an area that's had a rather difficult history, and I'll show you a bit of it, but it's turned out to be relatively peaceful and somewhat prosperous, and in this day and age now, free of all of the difficulties of the past. Now, the native people, though, have been largely exterminated, and there are very few archaeological remains. This is actually a Taino village in a ceremonial circle in Puerto Rico. And so when the Europeans first started coming, the Spanish and then the English, French, Dutch, etc., they were, well, the famous book is The Fatal Impact. They had the initial contact, which was often friendly, and then it became a struggle, and then a genocidal impact on the different people. And there are a number of different groups, the Taino, the Arawak, the Caribe, and the Lucayo, and there are only remnant and very mixed in populations of these original people. There may have only been a few 100,000 of them in all of the different islands, and many of them were for thousands of years coming from either North America, Central America, or particularly the Orinoco Valley. So the Caribe people were said to have come from the Amazon River Valley by archaeological evidence. And they conquered the other natives island by island, and they were particularly good at building sailing boats. They had that rig and that ability. But there are a few reconstructed villages. This again is a Taino village. And there are evidences of this, particularly in the music. Now I was just playing Garifuna music from the Honduran coast just right now, but if you listen to Puerto Rican music, Cuban music, you often have the trace of the native people's music. This is drums, rattles, huira. Like in Brazilian music, you have a lot of native indigenous instruments that have been brought in with the European and African influences to make a distinctive style, which is, of course, a great thing in the Caribbean. One of their great exports to the world is their music. Well, here are a few things in museums. A Lucayan chieftain's seat. So all these museums will have a little bit, but only a couple of the places in the all Caribbean have any, let's say, active indigenous culture anymore or language. Well, this all changed because of our dear friend Columbus. I gave a talk about him before, the admiral of the ocean seas who thought he was in Asia all the time, and again gave the misnomer Indians to the people of the Caribbean, and it's stuck ever since, though they themselves, of course, have their own names. So I showed these pictures the other day of Columbus bringing the sword and the cross, meeting the Arawak people who were generally friendly. And I showed this also the other day, but this engraving has a Latin saying on it, if you can see that, medicus retexit semel voceat inde semper excitam. Anybody got their Latin down? I believe it means that the American woman, in this case in her hammock, is inviting Columbus to take a snooze with him, and at the end of it, it's always exciting, semper excitam. Well, that's still the case here. But of course, the expansion of the Europeans into this area meant that the islands were the first thing found. Then they found the mainlands, and then they moved into from Florida, Mexico, Central America, all the way down South America, and later the rest of it all. But this is the first map of the Caribbean from the second in command of the Columbus expedition, Jose de la Costa. Then others came along. Ponce de Leon went to Florida, and it was the Spanish and the Portuguese that led the way, certainly. Here is Ponce de Leon in Florida meeting the Seminole chief Aguibana, who told him the fountain of youth is at that retirement village over there. Sorry, that's not funny. Anyway, but the impact of the Europeans was, let's say, compromised by their lack of knowledge of the natives and vice versa. And so, and there was, in this illustration, where they call these people not just heathens, but cannibals. And so then they classified them as subhuman, and that led to the enslavement of particularly the natives, the Caribe and the Arawak. The Caribe fought back, and as I mentioned the other night here, the name Barbados comes from the Spanish who came here first in the mid-1500s, and the Caribe had heard about these strange people, and they fought them away, tried to get them away from Barbados. So the name meant they were barbarians. That's where the name Barbados comes from. Not that they're that way anymore, but the enslavement of the natives led to them famously having mass suicides. There's a mountain in Dominica where hundreds of them jumped off a cliff into the sea rather than being captured by the slave trade. Well, those that were put to work looking for digging for gold or put to the agriculture died by the droves because of the European diseases, and this was the tale of the tropics. First of all, the natives got smallpox, the common cold, tuberculosis, all sorts of things that the Europeans brought. But the Europeans were also assaulted by finally malaria, yellow fever, again, tropical fevers. They weren't accustomed to this climate. And it said 3 out of 4 Europeans who came to the Caribbean died within 5 years of disease, if the natives didn't get them. And that, of course, meant that this plantation economy that was set up to grow sugar, it was such a valuable commodity, but it was labor intensive, and they didn't have any more natives. They tried to import the criminals and vagrants particularly of England who came to Barbados, but they ran out of those considering the size of the plantations, and that's when the slave trade became so important to provide the labor, and thereby some 5 million Africans were brought over to all of the Caribbean area, the largest number in Cuba, which only banned slavery in 1888, by the way. But so the economy of the sugar plantations meant that this was very wealthy, and Barbados and Haiti were the wealthiest colonies back in the 1700s for this trade. And this was the famous triangular trade. The slaves would be brought from Africa, they'd work in the islands, then the sugar would be processed, sent to North America, and then to Europe with the return trade of manufacturers' foodstuffs. So the northern colonies, as it was called in Barbados, meaning the North American colonies from Florida all the way up to Canada, sent livestock food, salt cod, Newfoundland. Salt cod was the staple for the slaves, for instance. So this triangular trade is what made the Caribbean prosperous for at least those in charge, not the slaves. But so this is the inheritance of this area like the rest of the Americas. And of course, slavery was not a new thing. It's an ancient practice. And at the same time that there was African slaves coming to Europe, there was also European slaves taken and put to work in North Africa and the Middle East. And so this is the heritage that we fortunately still have in a certain ways with human trafficking and modern forms of it. But this was an organized industry, and it was legal until it was finally suppressed in the early 1800s and through till today. But the labor alone was very terrible because, I mean, the Africans they could survive it. They were not as susceptible to malaria and yellow fever in particular, so they thrived in the tropical environment as they had in their native countries. But the labor conditions were pretty grueling all day, every day, except for Sunday. They converted to Christianity so they could get a day off. But this was all handwork, slowly mechanized, kept in charge by the overseers and the press gangs and the abuse of the people, so that there were often strikes and rebellions and things like this, and runaway slaves. And so this is a sad tale of these islands. And you'll still see the remnants of the plantations. I don't know if anybody went up to Gun Hill in that area. There's some colonial era mansions, and then the fields, which are mostly gone to pasture now. And some of the old sugar mill, windmills, rendering works. This one's in the east coast of Barbados. So this is where they would then boil it down to make molasses and pack it in cakes and put it into barrels and ship it off. And there are still remnants of this around the islands. The only major use for sugarcane nowadays is to make that magic medicine called rum, because now we have sugar is no longer such a precious commodity because we have sugar beets and artificial sweeteners and all these different things. But there's still some grown. This is a Barbadian mill. I don't know if anybody was on a tour or went up there. This is up in the highlands towards the east coast with the remnants of a large industrial work. And just outside this dock, you see the size of these industrial warehouses and loading facilities back when the primary economy here was sugar. Now it's one of many things they do here. But at that very place in Barbados, up there, I saw this sign, which is just a suggestion. Not that we do that on this ship at all. We are all, eager for the next meal, etc. But but back in the bad old days, it was a little more rough, I'd say, particularly if they tried to resist or to escape. So one of the old slave stories is the master calls in a slave, and the guy's going in, that white, evil, cruel fellow. Then the master thanks him for his good work and gives him a day off. And so he's going off, and the other slave said, "Why you get the day off?" I said, "I went and told that white bastard that I didn't say that." And the other guy goes in and yells at the master and immediately gets beaten. So, and then the moral of the story is, don't say what you think, especially to your boss. Not that we ever have that problem, but well, anyway, all these islands were terribly fought over by the European powers after from the beginning of it, when the Spanish claimed all of it. The Dutch, the English, the French all started fighting, and they had some tremendous naval battles over all these islands. This is at Les Îles, 1789, where major French and English fleets had a battle right where we're going to anchor in a couple of days. And time and time again, these different islands were traded over, or else they had a peace treaty and they sort of swapped them for this other part of the empire. Most famously, the Dutch traded Suriname for the little island of New Amsterdam, which became New York. So this is let's say the days when all of these islands were just pawns in the larger global conflict between the European colonial powers, even up to the Napoleonic time. But there hasn't been any major conflict this way since those days. But the forts remain. You'll see these on all the islands. Even in downtown Barbados, there's still, or Bridgetown right here, there's still an old Navy fortifications behind the harbor. This is the largest fort that is still here, Brimstone on St. Kitts. And a lot of them are now restored and opened, and historical museums to this era where tens of thousands of French and English and Spanish soldiers would be guarding these forts, but the conditions were, of course, harsh, and then many of the soldiers died. And so this is where they call the Caribbean the white man's graveyard, because many came, but so few ever got to go home again. Now this guy's still guarding that fort, waiting for his relief. But they're in beautiful places. This is actually the Fort Napoleon, right above Les Centres, where we will be in a few days. And so at least they had a nice view even if they had malaria. But this is just the heritage, and now, of course, there's a peace between nations, and well, sometimes there's still trouble. This is during the American Revolution when a detachment of Georgia regulars went and attacked the fort in Nassau, Bahamas, took it from the British and took all the guns, took them back to the conflict ashore. But Bahamas might have stayed with the United States had the troops stayed for a holiday at least. But the big event in the Caribbean history was the rebellion of the slaves in Haiti, which at the time was called Saint-Dominique, and that was the most productive and the most wealthy of all of these colonial plantation islands. And so a livery driver for one of the French officials, Toussaint Louverture is his name, led an uprising of the slaves and led them in military battle and then defeated the local colonial forces and then abolished slavery. And of course the French at the time were having the French Revolution, which then meant they could not get it together to come back and attack until later when Napoleon took over. And meanwhile the English made an agreement that they would recognize Haiti as an independent country run by freed slaves. And it was also let's say, Haiti became a pawn in the war between Britain and, of course, Napoleon. But they said that this is General Maitland, the British commander for the Caribbean, who was based in Barbados, right here. He was later said making peace with the Haitians is a trap for the French, because what happened was Napoleon gathered some 10,000 troops in the Navy when he had the forces and came over and attacked the Haitian forces, who were well trained and they had their own discipline, and the French troops got bogged down, and then they all caught malaria, and most of them died of disease, not warfare actually. But that was the end of the French control in much of the islands here. They still have Guadeloupe, Martinique, and a few, but that led also to the Louisiana Purchase, because Napoleon just gave up. He said he can't sacrifice more of his glorious troops fighting slaves. Well, anyway, island by island, they had their own different local history, but over time they were all emancipated. The British led the way, the first abolition, the first suppression of the slave trade. Again, the Spanish held on in Cuba and places. But this is a statue up here above Bridgetown as an example of the emancipation of all of the slaves all through the Caribbean. And of course, this meant there was a whole new era where they were the majority. And this is very poignant history here. And there's another Caribbean, let's say, parable about two big dogs are chasing a couple of rabbits, and the rabbits hide in a little hole, and the dogs are out there trying to get them, sort of like slave traders, or rather bounty hunters would chase escaped slaves. And so the rabbit says to the other one, "What are we going to do now?" And the other one says, "We'll just wait till we outnumber them." Which is the case. Now you have all these Caribbean islands. The African heritage population is the majority and have the political power, the democratic power, or the different islands have different versions of this. But here's the plaque right in the harbor right here in Bridgetown for the landing of the first slaves. And so you see all the little school kids go by and remember we were once slaves. Well, there are still European prefectures here. This is Saint Martin, which is both divided between France and Netherlands. And then it has its own council, but it's an island that is neatly divided in half between the French and the Dutch, and it's an open border. We're not going there. But so you still have all these linguistic divisions. Either they're French, Spanish, Dutch-speaking, and such. So this is where the heritage of the colonial period comes right down today. So even though they're right next door to each other, they often don't trade as much with each other as they do with their original homeland country, like Barbados is so tied to Great Britain, etc. All of these other islands are French and get subsidies with as a member département or the Outre-mer of France, so they get their health care and education, all these benefits. And so you'll see there's very distinctive differences in the islands. So this is in Guadeloupe, they're making French bread and they have cheeses and they have wine. You go to the Dutch side, they have beer and sausages. And so, this is Vive les de France, I guess. This is actually where we're going. Again, at Les Sons, a beautiful little village that's very, very French and full, of course, with French tourists. We're also going up here to St. Bart's or St. Bartholomew, which originally was a Swedish colony. And we'll be going to Gustavius, which is the King Gustav's honor that he had a tropical island. Eventually, in some treaty, it was given over to the French, but it still has Swedish heritage, even though it's all in French nowadays. But it occasionally gets a Swede to come there to reclaim it. But this is, of course, the famous mega yachting center. So this has to be the most expensive place to visit in all of the Caribbean, and they only take the euro. They don't know what that green dollar is. Well, maybe some do, but it's if you think Barbados is expensive, it's a bargain compared to St. Bart's. But what this village has is a lovely historic district of the Swedish-style tropical buildings, just like in southern Sweden, with verandas and little gardens. You can just get off the ship. Well, actually, we anchor. You tender into the town. You can walk through the village, and you can even walk over to a little beach. And so it's a particularly charming place with the remembrance of some of the Swedish residents there on the wall. And then there are all of the other British islands. Here's Turk and Caicos, which is north of Puerto Rico, south of the Bahamas. And again, lots of little islands, keys, and this, like many of the English islands, were asked to decolonize and become an independent country, and they didn't want to. Same thing with Barbados. There was a lot of debate why in the Westminster policy of the 1950s and the 60s, finally, the empire became the Commonwealth, let's say. But Barbados and Turk and Caicos applied to join the Federation of Canada. They figured they'd get at least a little more help, or at least they would get to go and see some snow or something. Well, the Canadian government didn't really want to adopt these little islands with all of their, let's say, problems. But BVI, British Virgin Islands, is still part of the greater United Kingdom, and so we'll be going there to Van Jost. But I put this picture up, which is the flag on our ship. And does anybody know where that flag is from? Well, it is the Bahamas. But the curious thing is, that's the Danish flag, because they were, for a while, part of Denmark, and they kept the Danish flag in the Bahamas, though the Norwegians still don't like to look at it. Similarly, the American Virgin Islands, St. Croix, St. Thomas, those are also Danish also. But when the Germans wanted to buy them from the Danes, the American government said, no, we'll buy them first, because they didn't want any Germans around the neighborhood except as our fine guests. Well, that's old water under the bridge. Well, you see, we'll be going from, our last stop is British Virgin Islands over Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, then we'll go, that's Turk and Caicos, then we'll go in the Bahama Channel and up into the Flores Strait to get to Fort Lauderdale, but we will not be going through the great maze of the beautiful islands of the Bahamas, nor are we getting to stop in Cuba, at least this week. And I was just saying to my sister, someday we'll go to Cuba just like our ancestors did, to have fun. And of course, when there was shipping, steamboats, this meant that the whole islands of all here could be reached easily. When it was all sailing, it was quite hazardous, because someone was asking why the Windward and the Leeward Islands. Well, it's all about the sailing tack. The wind is always the trade winds from the east. And so if you wanted to go to Barbados or some of the outer islands, that was the Windward. If you wanted to go down to the other ones downwind, those are the Leeward Islands. And it's applied variously as a general term. But when steamboats were invented, this meant that there was transports all over, and they thought that this would make a united area of all these disparate islands. But of course, it was the language that got in the way, and the other interests that just didn't see how you can form a country, full nation out of all the Caribbean islands, and especially a big one like Cuba, the largest of them all, which has its own particular history. And I'll just skip over it after the original 1905 Jose Marti revolution, assisted by the Americans to begin the Spanish-American War. Cuba was giving its independence because in Washington there was debates whether Cuba should become a state of the United States, but the northern states did not want a new southern state. Well, Cuba, and particularly the Castros, have been a thorn in the side of certain powers for a long time, and I thought the embargo would never end because Castro would never die. Well, he just recently passed away, but his brother, who was always the henchman, leader of the military, is now in charge, but he seems to be more practical, let's say. And so the Cuban Revolution, well, you can read all about it, except that it infected many of the other islands with that kind of kick out the Yankees, get your independence. It was also part of the decolonialization of the whole region. But what, of course, what turned out is that those that became independent became poor, and those who stayed allied with their original colonial powers, either directly or indirectly, like Barbados, have been prosperous. Cuba, along with Haiti, used to be the most prosperous islands in the Caribbean 100 more years ago. And Castro, for maybe what good he did for the people in some ways, he also led the economy to become the poorest per capita in all of the Caribbean. Now it's only matched by Venezuela. Well, that's politics for you. But down in this part where we are, the Cubans sent medical workers and some military to Grenada, which was an English-speaking island, independent, needed help. And so that led to the U.S. Invasion under President Reagan to kick the Cubans out of Grenada. And so here's a U.S. Marines landing. Now this is a very sore subject all around the Caribbean islands, Central America, because whenever there's a problem, then the Monroe Doctrine is invoked, and U.S. troops go to sort of sort out the problems. And here's the one that came to Grenada. This is a cartoon at the time with Reagan lighting Castro's cigar with a U.S. Marine Corps lighter. And sorpresa means surprise, an exploding cigar. Well, the CIA actually tried that to kill him back in the early 60s, but he quit smoking just in time. But so you go to Grenada now, you get graffiti like this because they didn't want to have a leftist or a communist party regime on their island, and so, well, it's just the way of history. And of course, now you still have the American Navy base on Cuba at Guantanamo over the objections of the Cuban government forever. And this is another sore side of the current affairs, with still a few prisoners left there. And but I believe that what's going to happen to Guantanamo is that somebody's going to make it into a luxury golf course and resort. I don't know who would want to do that with it, but maybe it'll be like Devil's Island. 50 years we'll go there and visit it as a spa, just like Devil's Island, right? Well, anyway, this is an issue of current times, and then there's Puerto Rico, which after the Spanish-American War, it was also considered maybe it should become a state also, but again, objections in Congress did not want Spanish-speaking states in the United States, and so Puerto Rico's been in this between status of being a commonwealth. It's neither independent nor is it a state, and the Puerto Ricans are American citizens, but they have their own local home rule, and now if you read the paper again, they are in complete default because of bad public spending, and they're being bailed out yet again from Washington. But if you haven't been to Puerto Rico, it's a beautiful place. It's sort of like a mini Cuba. But above all, in San Juan, you have this tremendous Spanish fort, the El Morro, just like over Havana Harbor. And so this is a legacy of the time when the Spanish had all this gold coming from Mexico and South America, and they would bring it over to Havana and then to Puerto Rico to put it on the galleons, take it back to Spain, but fight off the pirates and the French and the English. It commands the harbor. There's the Seabourn Pride right there, by the way, and some other canoe. But it's all being guarded again carefully by troops to this day, so no trouble happens. And Puerto Rico is a lively place, particularly has great musical culture. You see this little shop there? I think that's English, says The Tourist Trap. But they catch you, but they happily let you out. But Anyway, it has, if you have never been to Old San Juan, it's a historic district and a beautiful place, and the island is beautiful also. And this is their National Assembly with the flags outside. Well, I'll keep going. Now, I always wanted to go here. The flag of Barbados, though, is the Neptune's trident, which shows you how far out to sea it is. But we've already had our day here, but that is really a good motto, pride and industry, because this is a very industrious island, one of the now most prosperous of all the Caribbean with the highest literacy rate, almost 100%, a lot of mixed manufacturing, IT jobs. Sugarcane is still there, but of course tourism is now the big industry. I don't know if you went up and saw the old colonial headquarters and the old parade grounds for the British Army. On y soit qui mal y pense, God in my right. Well, once upon a time, the cannons, I mean, maybe you went up and saw this today. But you may also heard that George Washington, when he was age 19, came down here and spent a season with his brother being hosted by the local gentry, and that sort of inspired him to become a leader, I guess. And so they just recently opened up his house, and now it's a tourist attraction. And other visitors, this was a former royal from Greece who ended up going into exile and is buried in the cemetery on the east side of Barbados. I'm just showing this because this is now something that's no longer here. When I was here a number of years ago, I went to Bart's Castle, which is named after a pirate who had a station there and would flash lights at ships coming from Europe, and they would come thinking it was a harbor, and they'd come onto the beach and on the rocks, and then they'd send his crew out to scavenge on them, just like the pirates of Penzance. But this was a very fancy mansion that the family built, maybe 100 years ago, and had a beautiful ballroom and wonderful architecture of its period, but it was also falling apart. Now it has been taken down. Now it's a luxury modern hotel. Well, there it went. But one thing you'll see on all these islands are what they call the chattel houses, which were the original slave quarters that were built without a foundation, just sort of on a few rocks so they could be put up on rollers, and oxen could drag them around where they needed them as they expanded the fields. And so this is a vernacular kind of architecture which was definitely for the slaves, and now it's common housing, and now they fix them up. But this is sort of, it became disgrace that you live in such a small house, but then again, it was yours. You were not once you were free of the plantation, you could actually drag your house in and put it in town or start your own town. So a lot of them are in bad condition, but other ones are sort of fixed up as little bars. And here's a modern style that's actually for sale, and they put it on that tractor trailer, so it's like a mobile home, but Caribbean style. Of course, you wouldn't want to have air conditioning or anything like that, ruin your health. Well, here, this is Antigua, Barbuda. Maybe some of you have been there. Again, formerly British, but now independent. And it's a sort of like a little version of Barbados, but one of the features there is they have the original Royal Navy docks where Lord Nelson actually was assigned for a while, and they've kept this as a historic site, so it's an old-style compound with the original fittings and buildings, a yacht harbor, and they give a historic tour of this thing, and it's a view again of the past, but it's now an independent country, and but they are like in Barbados. They are proud to have had this British heritage. Now, the thought of all of these islands becoming one country was actually attempted by Whitehall to, for at least the English-speaking islands, to start what they call the Federation of the West Indies, which include Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, St. Kitts, and the BVI, and make a nation out of them. But they immediately couldn't agree where the capital was, and they said, why should we have to go up there to discuss our problems? So all of the islands finally refused, except what they did is make the Caribbean Development Bank and what's called CARICOM, which is a sort of a trade union among all the islands, including the French and Spanish speaking, depending on which one it is. And they still have the University of the West Indies from that era, which has campuses in various places, including St. Lucia, where we're going to go tomorrow. And so now most of these islands are self-governing, even if they still have colonial ties, in particularly the French Guadeloupe, where we're going. But if you get here during election time, you get this raucous democratic process. This one is can't hide the truth from Mr. Whoever Scarrett, and crime, poverty, unemployment, desperate young people, et cetera, et cetera. The Lilac Apartments, whatever. The bin scandal. Lord knows what's going on in the trash bin. Anyway, this is my favorite political party sign. That was somewhere in one of these countries. I said, well, there must be another party with an exclamation point for its logo. But of course, other people's political problems are always more amusing than our own, right? But anyway, particularly in these islands, they are very keen on education, and you saw a lot of kids out there in their uniforms, and so the educational levels here are actually higher than some other countries not far away. And of course, then there's the cricket, which is George here was saying. You went out and saw the fields today, the Kensington Oval, and so this is it's not. At least in the English-speaking islands, soccer is not that popular, but cricket is, of course, a world unto itself and competes with the Commonwealth countries. And so a lot of these little islands have the best players. And I'm going to go on a little bit about Haiti, which I said had a very prosperous economy, the slave rebellion, then independence, and then a misrule, I'd call it, right from the beginning. And it was also guaranteed its independence by the United States as the first colonial uprising, and then Haiti was the second one. And the United States guaranteed Haiti's independence as long as they compensated the French landowners. They put Haiti in debt right from 1810 or something, and they took 100 years to pay off that debt, which is why it got more and more poor, along with doubling its population every generation. And now the land is no longer productive. It's all been deforested and picked over. Now they have earthquakes, and it's the poorest country in all of the Caribbean. And also it ended up having their own local royalty, which then assumed terrible control over their own people. And then they had battles between the Spanish on the other side of the island, which is the Dominican Republic. And this Haitian general led the conquest of the Dominican Republic. And this is an argument between them still to this day, because they don't speak the same language and they don't like each other at all. They have a hostile border to this day. But then he was president of the whole island of Hispaniola, I think 1860 to 1888. But he bankrupted the country. The debts that he incurred were bought by an American company that then seized control of the customs and economy, essentially. This is now the Dominican Republic, and there's the border with Haiti. Occasionally we go into Santo Domingo or Samaya up here. But what happened is that the Dominican Republic also, with this rule of President Heureux, which his ironic French name is, he's President Happy. But the Dominican Republic and Haiti have become, again, a very poor country, and then they were occupied by U.S. Marines from 1918 to 1924 to kind of sort them out, because they were fighting each other and they were deeply in debt. Anyway, Santo Domingo is the oldest city in the Caribbean, founded by Christopher Columbus, and still in historic state, and has a product-oriented bananas and sugarcane again. Now it has some tourism and some modicum of prosperity now. But above all, it was where Columbus had his empire that he discovered, and he's still remembered there. I showed this the other day about Columbus, the great monument to him in Santo Domingo outside the city, the great Faro, the lighthouse of Columbus, is this tremendous building that President Balaguer built many years ago. But it's sort of a symbol of Christianity also, so that Columbus's tomb is in it, this remarkable building. Though he's also buried in Seville, Spain, and they still can't agree where he actually is anymore. He may be, as I said, on a ship somewhere. But this particular building, they light up at night with the guiding light of the cross on the sky, and that's when the whole city has a blackout until they turn this off. Well, religion is very important in all of the Caribbean. So you have all these different churches competing, Catholic and Protestant, evangelical. So every place you'll have all these very active churches now, some of them in disrepair in different islands. You saw the cathedral in Barbados that they've recently renovated. This one in Antigua, beautiful style. This is the one in Bridgetown right here. And but the Caribbean people are very religious, I would say, and they do have new churches, mostly evangelical. And I found a couple of sayings on the street. One of these said, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be men of courage, be strong, and then let justice flow like a river and righteousness like a never failing stream. Well, that's Martin Luther King. Well, here's another sign in the Dominican Republic. Jesus is coming on the 21st of April, 2011, but the plane was overbooked. He'll be here eventually. Then there are the other islands down south of here. The next island, South Trinidad and Tobago, which had again plantation economy, but for lack of slaves anymore, they imported a great deal, 100,000 or more Indians from British India, and most of whom stayed. So if you go to Trinidad, you'll see that there's a lot of Hindus and Indians to this day, but Caribbeans now. We'll be going here tomorrow, St. Lucia, with its flag, which represents the volcanic mountains, the Piton. And this is a lot smaller town. If you haven't been to St. Lucia, it's actually very charming because there'll be a couple other ships that you can walk off the dock right to the central market. It's a small town. It's not nearly as big as Bridgetown. And then it has mountains everywhere, so it's much more scenic. But again, it declared its independence, and then because of its limited economy, it got poorer and poorer. And now I was at this fishing village, the Anse de Ré, which they were catching almost nothing. I think there was a pretty good catch today at the fish market here, but we went to this village a number of years ago. I imagine there's a tour here from the ship. But what their worst problem is they planted bananas, and they had an exclusive import right to Britain for bananas for decades, and then when they became independent, they had to compete on the market, and the price of bananas fell so much that they've abandoned the fields, and now a lot of people don't have anything to do. And so that's a problem of the Caribbean all around. They have more and more people and only the same amount of land. Most of these islands cannot grow enough food for themselves, and the fish are mostly gone, so now they're importing fish from who knows where. So here's a project of the Japanese government to help the fishing industry, which of course means they'll chase more fish and there'll be less eventually, but that's one of the problems of the Caribbean. But the people go on. I say, like the beautiful islands get ravaged by hurricanes now and then. You have a very resilient population, and even the land sort of grows back. And so this is a metaphor for the Caribbean as a whole, that the people go on no matter how poor they get or what boom happens. Now, though, without tourism, many of these islands would be completely destitute. And so our visitation is a very important thing to them. And they have their own traditions. I would say one of the things they always say is you always take time to say hello and have a little chat. It's considered very rude to come up to somebody and say, oh, how much is that? Or how do you get to here? Instead of saying, oh, what's your name? How are you? They call it to lime in English. And even have a communications company called to lime here. So there's a lot of sayings among the people. And then there's all of the music. But I'll go back to this kid because I'll read you a couple of local proverbs. One is, sit still and you will see the belly of the ant. Meaning if you wait, you'll understand what's going on. And then the donkey says the world is not level, as in life is not fair. Surprise. And another, don't curse the alligator before you cross the stream. And another one, a ghost knows just who to frighten. Oh, well. And then the other one, this is a little less obscure. The sun keeps us smiling and the rain keeps us multiplying. And it's better to love people and use things than love things and use people. Well, and then there's all the music, and I'm not going to play anymore, but we'll hear, the Caribbean music, all of the islands have their own kind, calypso, salsa, etc. And a lot of this comes out of the religious tradition of the African religions. Voodoo, candomblé, this is Brazil, and around here, enchantresses, speaking with ancestors, and a lot of this is directly related to the animistic religions from West Africa. And particularly in Jamaica, where there were runaway slaves, and they set up their Rastafarian religion up in the mountains away from originally the slaveholders. This is when when the British attacked, the Spanish let their slaves go, and they ended up having redoubts and villages up in the Blue Mountains. If you've been there, beautiful place. They were called the Cimarrones at the time. And so this African independence, black power thing is so strong through the Caribbean and, of course, amplified around the world. Now you see the Rastas from Jamaica are everywhere, and this is characteristic. You don't cut your beard, you never cut your hair. So that's why you see these guys with tremendous hats holding in their bonnet of their hair. And they're all around. You see them on the streets here. Though I remember one of the women saying, oh, he's not a real Rastafarian because he drinks. You're only supposed to smoke marijuana. That's the religion. And they worship the memory of Haile Selassie, the last king of Ethiopia, of all things. But I would say, what hairdo could be more uncomfortable in a hot climate? Hey, they can take it because they have the right attitude. But it's almost well, you can see this now. Even European youth now do this to their hair, but at least they need the warmth. And of course, the great leader in the recent time, Bob Marley, and his band, reggae, and all this is now a worldwide phenomena. And Bob Marley himself, via Island Records, brought hundreds of millions of dollars to the community in Jamaica. So music is a kind of a salvation to them. And as one of them said, music is a kind of magic to make something out of nothing. And the calypso singers and the reggae singers, they often have words that we might not quite understand, but here's one of the famous singers saying, a prophet has no honor in his own land. The truth of this proverb I now understand. When you sing calypso in Trinidad, you're a vagabond and everything that is bad. And I'm here to rip out your heart and tear your culture apart. But don't go worship that Yankee flag. Well, anyway, it sort of becomes a commercial quality after a while, and so you can take it or leave it, but you can't avoid it or ignore it. And so, particularly the pride of Black Power and the independence is, sort of very well all over these islands. Is quite different than the attitude of the colonial times when it was a crueler time. Again, one of the big problems they have now, the old diseases are mostly conquered. Now they've had a terrible problem with AIDS. And so then this is a whole issue around the world here, but here's a bumper sticker from one of the islands just recently. And so I'll just show you a little bit here, more contemporary. Oh dear, I'm about out of power, so I better keep going here. Oh yes, let's change our hairdo again. And you already heard this up on deck, the great steel bands, quite fantastic. There's my own wife playing it, and she went Rastafarian on me a while ago. Anyway, but there are all these festivals, again, like Carnival, the Junkaroo, Trinidad, all the islands have big, fantastic festivals, and it's quite a time. But again, we just missed it, so we don't get caught up in this kind of fun. And we don't want to have too much fun while we're on a cruise, do we? But, this is the spirit of the islands, and then you have sort of a mixed ethnics, because they say the tyranny of color, skin color, is all over the island. So you're gradation, like Brazil, let's say, how European, how African you are. You get a lot of mixed couples and all of this. And one politician here says, ethnic politics is a lie because we all have the same needs, and the problems are not the color of our skin. But then again, that's the heritage, and so it's hard to ignore it. Well, I'll go along here before I'm done, and the prosperity has sort of been a good thing here, largely due to tourism in recent times. So here's a graffiti of a sharp young woman who has all the good things, and she's going to get to travel someday. Oh, my computer just went out, so I guess that's it, except that I'm going to just tell you the story of 3 Caribbean women who go to France for a vacation, and they 3 of them get into an elevator, and they start going, what's that odor? And one of them says, oh, well, I have Chanel No. 5. And the other one says, I have Dior. And the other one says, I have coconut and hibiscus. And I told you a couple of jokes last night, but I'll just continue on without any more pictures here because my battery is run down. But I'll just read you. We're going tomorrow to St. Lucia, where the national poet just died. I was on the news, Derek Walcott. And he was sort of a lyric poet, playwright also. But he wrote, I'll just read a few of his things. I seek, as climate seeks its style, to write, crisp verse as sand, clear as sunlight, cold as the curled wave, ordinary as a tumbler of island water. And he said, where shall I turn, divided to the vain? I who have cursed the drunken officer of British rule, how do I choose between this Africa of my blood and the English language that I love? Betray them both or give back what they gave me? And then he said another poem, so I shall repeat myself. Prayer, the same prayer towards fire, same fire, as the sun repeats itself and the thundering waters repeat themselves. For what else is there but books, books in the sea, verandas and the pages of the sea, to write of the wind and the memory of wind-whipped hair in the sun, the color of fire. So I hope you enjoy the Caribbean in all of its colors and peoples, and thank you very much. Have a good evening.